don't do anything wrong until something activates them. And then they will start behaving in a way that would be detrimental for our body function.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Tom Lee, who is an environmental microbiologist with an interest in bacteria and archaea living in extreme environments. Tom was born and grew up in Singapore, where he went to primary and secondary school education. He then studied in the U.S. during high school before returning to Singapore for 2 years of mandatory army service, which I didn't know was required. He then pursued his bachelor's and PhD in microbiology at the University of Connecticut, where he focused on bacterial growth on sulfur compounds in the absence of air. He furthered his education as a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Washington, where he cut his teeth in the field of genetics for these same organisms. Thanks for joining us, Tom.
Thank you very much for having me on, Heather. It's indeed an honor. We have elevated our interaction. Thank you.
Yes, and I promise, not to make this too scary of an experience for you, but I have to start with, because my audience is generally not an audience of biologists, and I had to actually look up what archaea were, that you had this interest in bacteria and archaea, and I was like, well, what's an archaea? Could you first of all just even start with what the heck is an archaea?
And essentially, an archaeon is a cousin to the bacteria, and they look the same. They are the same size. They can be found in similar environments. However, most of the environments that these archaea are in are more extreme. So they are in conditions on Earth that are high temperature, lower pH. In other words, the acid conditions are very high, high pressure, lack of oxygen, or maybe a combination of all of those. So this group is different in some minor ways, but in general, the distinguished surface characteristics is that they tend to be located in environments that are a little bit more extreme, where normal bacteria are found as well.
I can't help but every time you talk about bacteria or viruses or the bugs, whenever you talk about the bugs, I can't help but think about them being little people with little personality traits. And when you started talking about the difference between archaea and bacteria, I start to wonder, well, what makes them different that one could withstand such a more extreme environment?
Exactly. And we are still trying to learn and understand why. And I think that's sort of one of the amazing things about the field that I'm in, or just in biology in general, is that despite the fact that we're discovering a lot of things, we still don't know and understand a lot of things. However, what I can say is that these archaea and some of these bacteria that lives in high temperature environments, the structure of their cell, in other words, their body, okay, which is analogous to humans, is a little bit different. And they actually hold together much better at high temperatures. They don't break apart as the bodies of those bacteria that can be found in more normal temperatures. And so there's a little bit of difference in the chemistry of the chemicals that are found in their bodies that allow them to survive in those high temperatures. So the converse is also interesting in the sense of, well, these high temperature loving microbes, they get cold at the temperatures that we are more comfortable with, but they actually live in temperatures that are as high as boiling water or even higher.
So why did you study environmental microbiology? Why did you study that in the first place?
It's actually quite fascinating. I think maybe I can go back a little bit further to basically say that I've had interest in all life. I could just be fascinated looking at some birds in environment interacting, tadpoles swimming in a pond, fish chasing after each other or feeding. And so, really, it stems from just looking at life and observing behaviors. And in terms of the microbes, it is no different, as you mentioned. And so, just looking at how they behave in the environment and how they do it, and we can go a little bit more in details. But now, because we're very lucky to be able to observe microbial life through the microscope, effectively, we look at microscopes similar to how we look at humans because they are magnified. And we can actually see a lot of the things that they actually do, which is very surprising. The other thing that I really enjoyed about the environmental microbiology is, as you mentioned, the surprise that all these typical environments that people say that life as we know it cannot survive, but it turns out that life, at least from the microbial sense, tends to just inhabit niches, environmental areas that have their own environmental parameters. For example, whether it's too hot, whether it is too acidic, whether the pressure is so high that it can crush a car like a matchbox. And yet you have microbes that live in these conditions and thrive. And so the prevailing question that I have in my mind is that, wow. And then that's followed by how do they do it? And then when we find out how they do it, we follow it with another wow. I think the benefit is number one, it's beneficial to my just innate curiosity. Number two, a lot of times when we learn something new, no matter what it is, we have a new toy, we discover something new, we want to show it to people that we care about and people like our friends. It's no different from show and tell in school, which I know that's a big thing in American schools. And so you're proud and you also enjoy sharing the information to your friends. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that I really enjoy is that I start to understand the relationships between what these microbes do and how it affects my life directly. For example, right now, things are very hot in the area of gut microbiome research. And we are starting to realize now, when we did not realize as far as, say, 10 years ago, that microbes actually control, in some ways, a lot of our actions, how we behave, how we feel, and sometimes even some of our abilities, and also how our immune system matures. The other thing also is the food that we eat and consume, beer, yogurt. All these things would not happen without microbes in the activity. So that would be really boring if you can't have alcoholic beverages in the minds of some people, right? So I think one way of looking at it is that what do we lose if we don't have these microbes around? And we lose a lot of things.
Yeah, there's been a big shift in the last maybe 10 years on there was like this let's blast all the microbes out of our bodies kind of approach in medicine. It seemed like there was no tolerance for any bugs anywhere in a body, and everybody's using antibacterial this and antibacterial that and overprescribing antibiotics, which I think everybody has finally realized is not the way to go. But there's been this sort of big sort of blast everything out of the body sort of germ phobia thing, which frankly I actually don't think germ phobia is that weird. I actually think of it more as a strategic decision, like, can I choose the microbes that come in my body? I just want to be able to sort of like have a say in it rather than just like randomly have things start entering my body that I don't know if they're beneficial or harmful to me. But then again, things are so small. So, how do you even control that? But obviously, a whole bunch of awareness now about the benefits that so many microbes are giving us, like you said, they're affecting our behaviors, our immune system, and even our moods, right?
Yes.
So there's so much around this, and there's more of an appreciation for it. So now there's this question of what makes a good microbe and what makes a bad microbe, and how do you make that determination?
Wow. I think that's a curveball that I've actually never really thought about specifically. But I think my answer to that for now, and I think that's the beauty of it, because we base answers on what we know up till now, and it may change as we learn more information. But what makes a bad microbe and what makes a good microbe really depends on the environment and the individual, if I may, that interacts with that microbe. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we like to have fruit juice, and fruit juice is just essentially the juice of fruits that we squeeze. We enjoy it, it's sweet and so forth. But when you put some microbes inside, and they will break down the fruit juice because they grow on the food just like how we grow on the food. Right? We ingest it and we get nutrients from them. So the microbes do the same thing, except they are much smaller. So they grow on them. So essentially, the fruit juice becomes something different from what we expect originally. So you could say that the fruit juice have spoiled. However, depending on the microbe, they can actually produce alcohol from the fruit juice. That's called fermentation. And so when that happens, people enjoy that. So another group of people will say, wow, that's great. Same thing with milk. Milk in its original form is milk. But if you just have milk that is fermented and goes through a few fermentation steps, then you have yogurt. So the microbes that do that, they are bad for the milk, but maybe some people say they're good for the milk if you're looking for yogurt. So I know it's a bit of a philosophical question, but I think the simple fact is that when we look at our bodies, microbes that make us ill are bad, right? But there are certain conditions that make those microbes behave in a way that make us ill. Because depending on the microbe, there are some microbes that inhabit our bodies. They don't do anything wrong until something activates them. And then they will start behaving in a way that will be detrimental for our bodily functions. So I think I'm giving that answer, but I'm including some caveats, as you have heard. Thank you.
Yeah. There's a saying, if you ask somebody in Ayurveda if something is good for you or bad for you, then the answer is always depends. So your answer was actually really Ayurvedic in its spirit. So it's like basically that, first of all, what I'm hearing you say so far is that microbes, because you've studied this for a really long time. We're talking with one of the leading experts in this field in the United States. Okay. So basically, that certain microbes are going to thrive in certain environments and they're going to behave differently in different environments. And that, like you even gave this great example, that something could activate a microbe that's in your body for a long time, and all of a sudden its behavior changes because the environment changes. And I think that's really important because there's so much focus now on the microbes themselves and their behaviors, but people also need to understand, especially when it comes from a health perspective, that you can change the environment of the body. And if you change the environment of the body, that is going to naturally call out different functions and features within these microbes, and they will behave differently. They may grow more, they may, shift. I remember finding this great research that showed that the women's microbiome, that the diversity of the bacteria, the microbes in her gut during, I think it was the third trimester of pregnancy, that the diversity decreases significantly. I'm not saying that that's like a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact that that happens says something about that time doing something different to the bugs in the body, that the little bit of that diversity would change during that period. And obviously a woman's body is going through so many changes in that time, that makes a lot of sense. But there are changes that our bodies are going through all the time, whether it's seasonal, whether it's we travel to a new environment. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on when people go out into space that I have no idea about, which you might know something about.
Well, I think I know just simply from talking to people and asking certain questions like we all do. And I also want to refer back to what you mentioned earlier on, where you look at the microbes, something like people with different cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and so forth. And I think that's a very apropos way of looking at things because I want to bring up another analogy. It is that sort of refers to the idea that the environment can change. And the environment can be because of certain chemicals, the person's body, or even the presence of another microbe. So, for example, if you look at our home as the human body, and you look at us as the microbes, and if we have some guests in the home that is very unpleasant, we all know that it affects everybody in a very detrimental way until that guest eventually moves on. And the other thing, the converse can happen. We have wonderful extended family coming in, and they just bring a higher level ambience into the home. We really enjoy, and then when they leave, we miss them. So really, it's no different from introducing new microbes in or having the microbial activity change as a result of those new microbes, and also the food that comes in into the body affects things as well. And in many ways, as I've discussed with you over the time of our friendship, I've realized that the Ayurvedic approach is actually no different from the scientific method that I've been taught on, is that we really want to look at the big picture, look at interrelationship, cause and effects. What happens in the beginning can have multiple indirect downstream effects that could go on forever. And I think I'm beginning to appreciate that. Another way of looking at it is that I've learned to look at the forest in addition to just looking at the trees.
Yes, it's very easy for us all to get stuck on those trees, isn't it?
Yes, especially a tree that's flowering or has some unique characteristics.
That you could just get sort of hypnotized by. Okay, so Tom decides to study environmental microbiology and is fascinated by this fact that there are certain microorganisms that can live in extreme environments. And you decide to study ones that grow on sulfur compounds in the absence of air. And I'm imagining that can't smell very good.
Mhm.
And, but there's certain bacteria that will thrive, and these archaea that will thrive there. And other, bacteria will thrive in a different environment, which is also the analogy that I like to use a lot is that there are plants that grow in different environments as well. So every organism just has this environment that it does well in, that it can thrive in, and other ones that it won't thrive in as much. So, in terms of relating this to our bodies and the fact that our bodies are not really closed systems, they're open systems. Things are coming in and out of them all the time. And then there's the environments that we live in. Are there microbes that are unique to the inner lives of our bodies or the skin of our bodies that are not found in the environment? Or is everything just like a big mix of things that enters the body and leaves the body and it's everywhere outside of us as well?